To item 2.3, Vice Chancellor Russell, Instructional Materials Regulations. This was an issue that I got to participate with the Vice Chancellor on, so I look forward to your presentation, Barry.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. President and Board of Governors members. The change in the regulations, Title V regulations you received in the board packet, I just want to step through some of the information with you a little bit to refresh your memory. This has been an ongoing discussion for some time. Starting with a news report about some suspicious behaviors taking place with students being charged additional fees to take classes, which we investigated, and at that point found that in that situation there was no misuse of funds at that point. But that there were some things that needed to be looked at with the Title V regulations and updated based on the new kinds of electronic materials that are being used in the campuses throughout the states and that are becoming more and more prevalent in the effort to reach more student success. So we stepped back and looked at the regulations and specifically the regulations in subchapter 7, section 59400, which you have in front of you. And so the changes were looked at by several committees, and we had a specific committee that came together to look at the language, which included representatives from across the state, from all of the constituent groups in the state. And it was quite a large table. Many people joined us by phone. And we had several discussions. Following that, we drafted some language and took that to through various of the subcommittees that are existing in the system. They reviewed that, and so what we are presenting today is kind of the final look at what the language should be. So stepping through that quickly, the changes that are there, the biggest change is in the actual title of this subchapter, which now will read Instructional Materials instead of Other, because it was just more inclusive to call it one thing, Instructional Materials. And then I want to also refer to paragraph A under 59400, that what this section does is actually direct the local governing boards to develop policy. So each of the policies are locally developed by the local boards. This allows for some variety and some adjustment at the local level based on local needs, but in general keeps everyone on the same page as you go down the list of things that the policy must have in place. The next big change is paragraph B was added, which includes a limitation and kind of a protection that the fees that are going to be charged for instructional materials cannot be used for administrative purposes. Colleges can't take things that are totally administrative in mind and push that cost off to the student. So if there are things like, an example would be a total system that's used to deliver instruction, like Blackboard or Etudes that many of our campuses use, those costs could not be given to the students directly. Those are administrative. The colleges should provide those. Another thing could be something like a grade book, that if a grade book is part of a system, that piece cannot be pushed off to the students, that is an administrative requirement, or a requirement that a faculty member should be doing with every class and not something that the students could be individually charged for. And then in the C paragraph, we took on the task of how long should these materials be available. And there was a sense earlier that the materials had to be available forever. But in the discussions with people, the publications, the electronic publications that are coming out, similar to an iPhone app or even a piece on the web page, those things are updated constantly and change a lot. And so, and in some ways, a student couldn't get endless access to those things. They're there for the period of time in which the software is up and going, and then they're not available. So we made some adjustment, in this case, providing a window for the materials that are selected to be open up to a 2-year period of time. And at the time when the students purchase the materials, they are to be made known how long they have the materials. So it's not a guess for the student. They know that if these materials are only available for 6 months or for 2 years or for whatever period of time, they know, and they are making the selection on that length of time that they have access to the materials. And in some cases, that does affect the cost, but it also allows the students to be more frugal in how they access the information. The fourth change I'll highlight is in paragraph E, where it directs the Chancellor's Office to develop guidelines, further guidelines past these regulations that will provide a little more how-to information from the Chancellor's Office of how to go about doing these things. And it is our typical fashion that when we develop guidelines, we also do that through the consultation process of having various constituent groups in the state at the table as we develop those. And in this case, most strongly, the Academic Senate would be involved in helping draft those guidelines that affect the choices of materials by faculty. Then moving on to the definitions, the 59402, another of the major changes in this area was the removal of the word tangible, which seemed, as the group discussed this, seemed to be the problematic word that had been added some years ago in the regulation to provide some definition. But in this case, it became the stumbling block of many of the innovations that were happening, because many of those things, an iPhone app is not necessarily tangible in the strictest definition of the word. So we felt like it really didn't add anything to the language at this point, so we took the word tangible out. And you'll see that throughout the whole section. And then the last point I want to make is in section 59404, where it talks about district policies and regulations. There was a sentence added, and this sentence was added in response to kind of the current ideas out there, and there are several pieces of legislation and other things happening that are drawing attention to the cost of these materials. And so what this does with this sentence is it, in the policies that districts are developing, that they should direct the faculty to take into consideration the cost of these materials and the effect on students. So those are the changes that are inside this Title V regulation change, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Members, Member McDougall.
In some respects, this might be seen as innocuous or mundane a matter as could be presented to the board dealing with instructional materials. At the same time, it causes me a tremendous amount of concern for the potential of misuse. And I very much have confidence in Vice Chancellor Russell's presentation, but do want to understand what we're changing here, because it could be fairly substantial in terms of the costs that have to be accepted by students. And right now, if there's anything that I would like to see us avoiding, it would be additional costs for students. And it does say it's going to be an area of material of continuing value to the student. So my assumption is that something that has continuing value means that the student will take with him or her that product with them or continue to have access to it after the experience of that class is over. Second, it says it shall be provided options at the time of purchase. My assumption here is that the student will not be limited to one choice, and that the option will in fact be an alternate means to achieve what would be achieved by the material that he or she is obtaining, and not just an option of not having it. So I would like to ensure that we have some clarity as to what an option is. An option to me is another method by which that same service can be delivered. And if that's not what's intended, I would like to know that. And then the final thing, I appreciate the statement that these policies shall direct instructors to take reasonable steps to minimize the cost of instructional materials. That is so open to interpretation, it almost has zero meaning, it almost sounds gratuitous, and as a regulation, it's not a very good regulation. It's something that maybe should go at the beginning in a preamble of some type that relates to instructional material. But to me, I find it too innocuous to have much meaning, because it is wide open to interpretation. So those are my thoughts about it. I think the primary thought I have, concern that I have, Vice Chancellor Russell, is in terms of the options at the time of purchase, and the sense that this will be something of continuing value that the student will able to take for him or her.
Okay.
Vice Chancellor.
And I'll ask Steve to chime in if I miss some of the points here, because Steve did work very closely on this process as well. The continuing value piece was one that we did struggle with a great deal, of providing some parameters that provided continuing value, but at the same time not limit the faculty choices so much that some of the really great and very effective, proven effective practices that are out there are absent from the instructional choices. So in our minds, the idea of continuing value could be met in several ways. One could be that if it is a website sort of situation, that students could actually print off the materials that they wanted to keep and for further use, so that they would have something that they could take with them after the fact. And I do, I'm kind of focusing in on continuing value as far as these electronic materials, but I do want to make sure everybody understands. Instructional materials are a whole host of items that are out there. It could be safety goggles for a chemistry class. It could be welding rods for a welding class. So, and depending on how some of those things are used, and do they have continuing value later on after the class? Do they take it with them afterwards? Those are some of the things that we have in our guidelines, that we explain further in the guidelines what is the intent behind this language. So in this case, I think most of those descriptions exist now pretty much in the guidelines about what the definition of continuing value means. But specifically with these new kinds of website access issues that kind of brought this question up, we've been using the idea of continuing value as if the students can access the website and be able to print off the materials that are on the website to be able to use for later.
I would just add on the continuing value piece, the fact that we provide for access for 2 years, or up to 2 years, was intended to also address this continuing value requirement. You know, a lot of this we thought about it in terms of textbooks, and the idea that people use textbooks after their class is over, but most people don't use their textbooks 10 or 20 years later because the textbooks become outdated, but that doesn't mean that did not have continuing value. So if it had value for another 6 months or a year into the next class, and if they're taking Algebra 1 then on to Algebra 2, they want to refer back to Algebra 1, that would be continuing value. It wasn't necessarily that continuing value meant forever. So that was not the expectation. So it's, I hope that provides a little bit more clarity on what we were trying to accomplish with continuing value.
Member McDougall.
Yeah, I appreciate the explanation, and I certainly didn't think it would be something that would last forever.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that perhaps when this comes back in the second reading, that we have some definition of continuing value to which we can refer. It doesn't have to be part of the regulation, but at least be presented to us as a board. And then the other question on options and what that means.
Oh, yeah, the options at the time of purchase. And here again, the bigger picture of instructional materials includes things like textbooks, not only these websites that we're talking about. And in cases where faculty select a textbook, it is the expectation for the student to be successful in that class that they purchase the textbook. If they cannot purchase the textbook, then many of the colleges put textbooks in the library for them to gain access to. So it's not that the campus is forced to provide the service for free if the student cannot pay for it. It's that there is another way to gain access at this to this material.
And just to follow up on that point, with the reference there to options, and I think you hit on the key issue. The options are to the term, that the student have the option to purchase the material either just for the length of the course or for up to 2 years, and presumably there would be a price differential in terms of that. It was not the intention that options there refer to not purchasing the materials or purchasing other materials. So that is not what options is intended to talk about there. The options was specifically talking about the duration. And the last comment was on the statement in 59-404. I'll just chime in and say that this was one of those sort of compromise statements. There were voices that wanted it to be, frankly, weaker yet, that instructors should not even be directed to take reasonable steps to minimize the cost of instructional materials, because that was intruding on the purview of instructors and their choices of materials. So this was sort of, although it's not strong language, I would say it was the result of some compromise, in that we wanted to implore colleges to help their faculty understand the importance to students of keeping costs down without being too prescriptive in terms of directing faculty as to what they could and could not assign. So it's that sort of language. So you're correct. It's not strong language. It was an attempt to continue the general movement we've had over the past few years to make faculty more aware of the cost of textbooks. There's been a lot of progress in the last few years where faculty are paying more attention to that, and it was in that spirit that this language was included.
Thank you.
Member Melamed.
Under the option question, sometimes when you're starting a course, you don't know if it's a good book or not. So is there something that as you're getting further into the course or towards the end, if you did want to extend it, you just took the short-term option, and now you want the long-term option, do they let you do that? Or is it you have to decide that at the very beginning?
Well, I mean, if you're purchasing the textbook or the materials up front at the beginning, obviously, and that's the intent, is that you have the materials at the beginning of the course. If you get halfway through the course, if it's a textbook and that is not being used or not useful in some ways, you can, in some cases, resell the textbook. Or if you're renting, textbook rentals are very
Well, I'm thinking in
popular.
the electronic world.
But in the electronic world, I mean, you would buy it for the period of time.
Well, I'm thinking
My
opposite.
assumption would be that there would be ways to extend it
Right.
if you want, but that would basically, the publishing or the people who own the electronic systems would have their processes of setting that up. It's not something that, this is not an attempt to control those processes
Okay.
as much as give direction for the selection of the instructional material.
Like I was just thinking, you know, if it's a grammar book or an English reading book and you really do love it and you want to keep it in your library of electronic things, you know, you don't know that when you're signing up in the beginning. So that's why I was thinking about that.
Other comments? Vice President Perez and Member Belinsky.
I would support Member McDougall's comments regarding the instructor's responsibility to ensure they're taking steps to minimize costs, but more importantly, I think to ensure that books that are selected are fully utilized, because I myself as a student, and I see many other students, being directed to purchase a lot of books at oftentimes where maybe just one chapter in a book is utilized, or maybe it's not even referenced during the semester, but yet they've had to purchase 4 or 5 different books for a particular course. And to me, that's a waste of the students' money. And also, if we're only utilizing one chapter, if that, of a book, how valuable is that true chapter to the overall coursework? So I would really love to see some type of verbiage around, if instructional material is required, that it's required because it's being fully utilized, not that students are being required to purchase an abundance of books that aren't fully being utilized.
That's a very valid point. I would only comment that what you have before you is a very limited subject, which is these online instructional materials. Your comment applies to really any sort of instructional materials, and it probably would require a broader discussion on that topic, as opposed to inserting such language in this particular more limited regulation. So we appreciate that comment.
I would say if students are having to pay for it, then it's appropriate here as well as in other areas. The bottom line is we have to minimize the cost to the students and make sure that any types of materials that they're required to purchase are being utilized, and that it's not costing the students a lot of money for something that they're not fully utilizing.
Member Belinsky.
Just a question and a comment. As this discussion with the group that you worked with went on about trying to revise instructional materials, and a lot of it has to do with the supplemental things that come with a textbook that have driven up the cost, was there any conversation about bookstores and bookstore contracts? And the reason I raise that is because, like in my own district, we have faculty that put out what textbook they want without any realization that that textbook has all these supplemental discs, et cetera, and the bookstore is unwilling to come back to faculty members to kind of discuss that with them. And in response, it's like, well, no, we're going to put all that extra stuff, the bookstore says, because we need to make money. We're not here for, just because most bookstores are not local run by the college. So I'm curious if any of that came out, because we have a lot of instructors that say, I didn't want all that extra stuff. I wanted a textbook. I saw the textbook. That's what was sent to me for review. I walked through it, picked through it, and now the bookstore has this leverage. And because we're 72 different districts, we can't even get a state leverage on that kind of thing. But did that come up at all, or?
We did have a member from the bookstore community at the meeting to provide some feedback into that, and he did discuss some of that, but there's nothing in this regulation specifically targeted towards bookstores.
Because, again, that sentence about instructors sometimes the instructors don't have full control over that. And so I think we need to be mindful of that, and I don't know if there's somewhere in the guidelines that could advise the districts about how to negotiate contracts with bookstores and some do's and don'ts, so that, they could say, well, no, the state's saying, here's some guidelines we should be following. We'd like to do that throughout the state.
Yeah, and the regulation, currently does provide that individual districts shall develop policies and regulations pertaining to this, consistent with the conditions and the intent of this chapter. So, perhaps we can work with the districts to see to it that their policies are more
I think it would be helpful.
complete. I think that has been happening over the past few years already, with the efforts of the Affordable Textbook Task Force and such things, but it may not have reached as far as it should, and we can continue with that.
Member Belinsky, I was certainly at the first meeting and did hear the guy from the bookstore community, and I very specifically remember him talking about contracts that they were tied into, and that it was, it is a revenue generator.
Yeah, and it's a
For
problem.
sure, that I think fairly is an issue
It's a problem.
here, and I can see both sides of it. But I agree, I appreciate your comment. Member Storm.
In regards to the electronic access to materials, okay, now sometimes a student will get into a class and they have to drop the class for whatever reason. They don't have time, or maybe they're not ready for that material. Once we've purchased and opened, if it was a disc or something like that, we can't return it. If it's something that's online, we've just purchased it, and although we have access to it, we're not using it. So will there be a return policy? Has anyone thought about if a student will not be utilizing it for whatever reason, about getting their money back? Because with a textbook, you can take it back to the bookstore.
Yeah. Our regulations don't get into that sort of the transactional part of the purchase of textbooks or instructional materials. I think that would be something that would be attractive to students, and I would hope that publishers would be sensitive to that. But our regulations have not historically gotten into the relationship between the purchaser and the seller of the textbook.
So, Vice Chancellor, let me just ask this question. I'm not necessarily endorsing this. Would it be within the Board of Governors' purview? For instance, you said that we say these regulations allow individual colleges to set their own policies, right? And we're giving some direction, not a lot, it seems to me, but some. Is it within our purview to go further if we so chose?
Yes, it is. What you would be doing then potentially is limiting the scope of materials that might be available to instructors, because you're putting more restrictions on them. So certain materials that instructors may wish to require of students would not be permitted to be required. So you have to balance that against the benefits of those requirements, because some of these materials have been proven to be very effective in the instructional process. But yes, you do have that ability in the context of required instructional materials.
Yeah, I only say that in that I'm hearing comments from my colleagues here, concerns from different sides. So I'm trying to establish the parameters here, and again, not necessarily endorsing anything one way or the other, but Member Ramos and Member McDougal.
Yeah, I don't know how applicable this idea is to what we're capable of doing, but it strikes me that from my experience with the Foundation for California Community Colleges, they have done a remarkable job in recent years through their College Buys program in bulk purchasing materials and furniture and other items that have lowered the cost systematically for access to any number of important ingredients in the educational proposition. And I just think that when I contemplate the idea of giving so much local control to the acquisition of these materials that, you know, it may become uneconomical to do so and very disparate, that maybe at this level, some standardization and some partnership with the foundation would be warranted where there are, at least in certain curricula centers, a high demand for common items where, you know, through the foundation, the online software could be purchased at a much lower, much more affordable cost, even if we don't impose it on the colleges to utilize that material. If it's an option, I think that it would drive many students and many faculty to use that option. And perhaps it would also be possible with the technology to draw down, rather than a whole book, a chapter or a segment of the material at a lower cost, a kind of a la carte sort of purchasing basis. So I don't know if that's something that the foundation is interested in pursuing. We have our leadership from the foundation here with us today. Maybe it's a conversation we could start with them. But I just think in principle, we're inviting diseconomies in a system that's struggling with economics and in a population of students that's struggling with cost of education. I'm reluctant to give that kind of, even though I believe in local control, I'm reluctant to sort of take this opportunity off the table when it exists. It's accessible, it's been proven in other contexts to work. I would just really encourage us to explore that option as something that could be embedded here in some way, shape, or form.
Member Ramos, excuse me, Member McDougal, I know that I certainly had a conversation with the foundation on that issue, building upon the college, you know, buys program, and I think you put it well that that could be an option, not a mandate of any kind, but it would certainly, in another discussion, you know, could be an initiative that we could work with the foundation to, you know, to put forward. Member McDougal, then the Chancellor would like to say something.
Yeah, I just like to summarize my thoughts on this. I understand well the dilemma that exists. On the one hand, we want to ensure that students have access to the most modern, if you will, and the most effective learning materials, and a lot of those come via the technological systems that are available. They don't fall neatly into what has been in the past instructional materials. The other side of that dilemma is the cost to students, the access issues, et cetera. Personally, I will come down on the former, i.e., to give the local campuses the authority to support instructional materials being available electronically. My expectation and hope would be that there would be tremendous sensitivity on that campus to keep the costs as low as possible. That being said, I would also urge that we look at options such as Board Member Ramos mentioned about purchasing through our system capability to get cost effectiveness. And I would also like to request that if it's feasible, if it's not feasible, forget it. But I would like to begin to plot what is happening on our campuses if we have these data about what increases in student fees are coming about in terms of instructional fees. It's one thing to approve a change in policy. It's another to monitor the effect and consequence of that change to see if it's having a negative effect. And I don't know if it's possible to do that with a data system, but if our data system allows for it, I would request it. But Those are my concluding
Yeah,
comments.
I just, on your last point, I think it's a very valid comment. I think the, part of the difficulty in getting those numbers is that the big difference is that in the older hard copy textbooks, students had the opportunity of selling it back. And in this case, they're not selling these materials back. So even if the cost to the student is comparable between buying something electronic and buying something in a textbook, the textbook, they can get some money back for it, and the electronic, they wouldn't. So there's a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison there.
A little bit, but it's better than.
I agree.
Chancellor Scott.
Well, this is a very interesting discussion, and I will tell you that as a former member of the legislature, this concern has been raised by a number of legislators. The rising cost of textbooks. I believe there was one law, and I haven't done research on it, but one law which indicated that faculty members, when they talked with a publisher, that the publisher were obligated to tell them the price of the textbook. Before some time, a faculty member said, well, I read this textbook over, and it's a great textbook. And they didn't realize that it was selling for $160 or something like that. So let me, number one, we're trying to solve a problem on online materials. But there's the larger problem out there of the rising cost of textbooks to students. In fact, because of the relatively inexpensive cost of tuition at community colleges, many students find that the cost of their textbooks exceed the cost of the tuition at a community college. So maybe we can get through this issue on online materials and then open up the bigger issue of the rising cost of textbooks, whether it's electronic, which most of us have hoped would mean lowering the cost rather than increasing the cost in any way. Let me just tell you some of the issues we've got going here. One is the issue of free enterprise. We are dealing with the whole issue of we can't dictate to a publisher what a publisher will charge. And unfortunately, this is not exactly a free market. We also are talking about faculty rights. It's a very touchy issue when faculty feel like they ought to have the right to dictate what textbooks that they want to be used for their particular class. Now, admittedly, there are abuses there, and I think Member Perez cited the fact that sometimes faculty are unwise in recommending a book that's scarcely used. But I don't know whether or not we can come up with any kind of mandate that would solve that problem other than the bully pulpit to say, please don't do that, because you've got some very economically stressed students who are there. But and then we have the whole issue of local control versus a statewide control. I could tell you that if we had a little more state power, we could probably save the local districts a lot of money. But you and I both know that there would be local districts that would maybe strenuously oppose that because they say we want to buy what we want to buy in the way of furniture or whatever. So maybe we can focus on online materials this morning, and we would be glad to continue this discussion on the rising cost of textbooks. But I thought maybe in saying these few things that I would try to point out there's a complexity here that's not always easy to solve. And we do have that. The only time when I was one time a vice president of instruction and a certain faculty member recommended a certain textbook which he had written and which he was getting the royalties for and for which it was privately published, and he was, in my judgment, asking an exorbitant price. It's the only time I ever remember overruling a textbook selection. And at that point, although despite his strenuous objection, I was able to drive the price of that material apart. My own feeling is that faculty senates, this is a recommendation to academic senates, ought to adopt a policy that says that if you are adopting a textbook that you have written, that's fine, but don't collect royalties for your class because that's a conflict of interest. You know, if you did that, then if you want to recommend your own textbook, fine, but you shouldn't profit from it, because I believe that's a little bit of a, not a little bit, it's an actual conflict of interest. But once again, I don't know that I'm in a position to try to, you know, legislate that, but I think that academic senates in their, perhaps in their own purview in a local district could see that would happen. So we've got some problems here. We've got faculty responsibilities, which I understand. They know better than anybody else what materials they need to support their class, their classes. And we have publishers who are in the business, and yes, they are in the business to make money. Now, a question on occasions is, do they gouge? And I've had some tendency to think that's true. But it's a little hard to dictate the price. So let's just, this has been a great discussion, and maybe we can focus in on online materials, but we can lead to a broader discussion about how we can address this entire issue of relieving students for the rising cost of materials for a class.
Other comments? Okay, Vice President Perez, I think we have a speaker.
Yep. Stephen Rhodes, Association of American Publishers.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Rhodes. I'm representing the Association of American Publishers. I might just give my 1 or 2 sentences, okay, of my formal, and then maybe I'll talk about a few of the comments and concerns that folks had. We will probably submit 45-day language. Right now, the only real concern that we have expressed is that the implementation date. It will take some time on some of these issues to implement them on the computer systems, and some of the publishers have asked for a 6 to 12-month implementation date or delay, and we will continue to ask for that. Some of them are hard. I like the Chancellor, think this discussion was extremely good, extremely healthy. It did raise the issues that it's just not the publishers that are concerned and responsible. It's also the bookstores and the faculty. I do think, and if I'm wrong on this, people should get back to me, that you can buy one chapter of a book if you need to. You don't have to buy the whole book, and the publisher will provide that one chapter. I do think on the bulk buying on foundations at the community college and other levels, that's certainly something that you should be exploring and taking advantage of. The cost of a book is, like the Chancellor said, it's in law now. The publisher has to provide the cost of a book when they talk to a faculty member, and that is the way it should be. Okay, I worked on that law. Also, you can use the ISBN number. I actually spent a good chunk of time yesterday doing this, which will go to a number of places, including the publisher's page, and we'll see the various costs and the various supplements that is provided. These are tough issues. We look at the e-books as bringing prices down. You always have to be careful in things like return policies and so forth, because that might work the other way. You know, we're proud of the books and the materials that we're producing, and we think they've been very effective. And it's interesting on these discussions, I never hear anybody criticize how effective and the fact that we're not focusing on the students that need to be addressed, and the students that you're worrying about, and the students that are dropping out. We have a problem in this state, and you are spending a lot of time to try to address that problem. And we appreciate that, and I just want you to know we are spending, because it's in our interest to, the same amount of time to address it. Thank you.
Okay, Steve, just a question I'm not sure I understood. You will be submitting 45-day language. What does that mean?
Well, I think you go out for a public opinion well, this is good, make sure I'm understanding the process right, okay? You go out for a public 45-day public comment period.
Public comment period
Right.
between the first and second reading. There's an opportunity for the public to comment, that this is the opportunity to get the word out,
Right.
and now for the next 45 days, we will receive comments.
Right, and the second part of your statement was, I'm not sure I understood, you wanted a 6 to 12-month delay on implementation?
Yes, if you're going to make something available for a longer period of time, like 2 years, as
Yeah.
opposed, the books I looked at on the e-books yesterday were like 1 year. You're going to make, especially the interactive type of programs, then you got to go in and change your computer systems to do that.
I see.
That is difficult.
I see. Okay, thank you. All right, is that it, gentlemen?
I would only point out that this is a first reading.
Right.
We are coming back next time, hopefully with a second reading. If there are substantive changes, it would not be a second reading. It would be a first reading again. We've received a number of comments. Depending on how those comments play into the what we're doing, there may or may not be another first reading. So it would be helpful to me if I could get perhaps some consensus from the board on some of these comments. For example, the comment by Member Perez to take a look at the broader issues of how textbooks are required and whether limitations where only a portion of the textbook is used. Something like a change like that certainly would mean it would not be a second reading. We would be coming back with something much more substantively different. So some of these other comments were presented by one or perhaps two members of the board, but I don't have a sense really from the board whether the regulation you see before you should come back in its present form or a different form.
It seems to me, and board members, you can comment too, it seems to me that this is going to require a little more conversation, and I think the board is probably okay if this comes back as a first reading again, and to give members an opportunity to provide input. This is not something, and correct me if I'm wrong, Vice Chancellor Russell, this is not a time-sensitive matter?
Well, only in the fact that in protection of students and
Right,
so forth,
right, understand. I mean, but
pushing that out, but that's.
I just get a sense from the board that maybe we need a larger conversation around this. Member McDougall.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on the Chancellor's suggestion, which I thought was an excellent one.
Yeah.
And that is to look at the regulations that are before us today as the focus primarily in terms of technology and technology equipment, but that we look at the bigger issue of textbooks and follow up on that. So my conclusion would be, I do not think it would be inappropriate to necessarily move ahead, because I would think that there are on many campuses a backlog of how to use the wealth of material that's available electronically. So we could move ahead on this as a second reading, but then recognize that the larger textbook issue would be addressed following that.
Vice President.
The only thing I would say, if it's applicable, the same situation from an online perspective, that students are having to purchase multiple items and that situation occurs, then I would prefer that you go back. Let's do it right the first time and let's address it. That would be my preference, opposed to moving forward with this. If the same situation occurs with online reading materials in the textbooks, which I believe it does, then I think we need to do it the first time. So I would recommend that you go back and rewrite to address the issues that we discussed today.
Other members? Does that give you any guidance? Not a lot, huh?
Mixed.
So, mixed. Yeah. Well, Member Storm?
I have to agree with Vice President Perez. I think that it's essential that we cover that area as far as additional materials and if they're not being used. So I'd like to see some language covering that.
Member Belinsky?
I think we're into multiple issues, and
Yeah.
I do agree with what the Chancellor said and what Member McDougall said, that we need to separate those issues out. I mean, there's one issue was to update the instructional materials regulations that haven't been updated in years to get at the issue of electronic or additional supplemental materials that just weren't there when the regulations. There's the additional thing of cost of textbooks, but I don't know that this was originally to say what you could pick and what you couldn't pick. That seems to me yet another issue that we need to address, of some kind of directive in the sense of good practice. Why would you require people to buy things that you should put on reserve in the library if all you want them to do is look at one chapter of the book, as opposed to it's like, rather than mix them all together, we should probably categorize them and work at them.
So,
That's my opinion.
Member McDougall?
Yeah, I think Member Perez is making a good point. However, I think it's a point that can be dealt with in these regulations coming back as a second reading. I mean, essentially, what the point is we don't want instructional materials to be at random being selected, and maybe they'll use some, maybe they will
Right.
not. We want something in the regulations that make it very clear when students are paying out of their pocket, the material they're purchasing should have a central role in the course itself. And I would think that issue, as best it can be defined, it's still going to depend on the goodwill on the local campus, could be defined in the second reading, the preparation of this.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So we have another comment from Michelle Plotty.
Good morning. I couldn't sit back there and make faces and not come up and actually say something. I think the regulations before you provide a good balance between saying you need to worry about cost and not restricting faculty from choosing materials that they believe are of high quality. I heard some good conversations here. There should be a mechanism where faculty who want to use something that's more expensive can come together and find a way to drive the price of that resource down, and that would be a great thing that we could work on. But ultimately, you're not going to fix all the myriad of issues that are out there regarding costs of materials with this one piece of regulation. So I would encourage you to focus on having the regulation fix what it's intended to fix, and then have a broader dialogue about other issues regarding textbook costs. So I just wanted to put that idea into your head. So thank you.
Thank you. So let me get a feel from the board. Are we comfortable bringing this back as a second reading, but also introducing at our May meeting, and it's something I could work with the Vice President and Chancellor on, putting forth a larger discussion on textbooks in general? Vice President.
I'm comfortable as long as this particular document somehow addresses the issue, and I think it's easy to wordsmith it. You don't have to rewrite the whole thing, just that thought has to be given to the utilization of materials, that it is being utilized. I think it's an easy way to wordsmith this, to bring it back with the same document.
Okay. Member Izumi.
And I agree with you, President, that, I feel comfortable with that. And I appreciate all the comments of my colleagues here. I do think, though, that what President Pilates said is also something that we should consider in terms of what was actually proposed to us here, and that, it's good to expand the scope of the discussion,
Yeah.
but maybe, in terms of, like, we're looking at two different things.
Okay. So are we, Member Baum?
No, again, I wanted to endorse that approach.
Okay.
because I don't want to give up the idea of local control and also
Right.
the responsibility of academic senates in addressing these issues, too.
Okay. Okay, we will proceed that way. Thank you, gentlemen.